Hello, I am Samuel Hansen.
Hi, and I'm Robbie Barker, and we're a part of Dr. First's SSTDR team for impedance analysis and use with photovoltaic systems. Our project was contributed to by Dr. Samuel Kingston and Evan Benoit. So, why SSTDR? When it comes to solar pet fields or any kind of live wire system, SSTDR can help with monitoring the system. And one might ask, why do we need to do that when we have technicians that go out and work on these solar fields or any other kind of system like this? And well, the answer is, as you can see from the image, that when it comes to a really large system like this solar field, that as you can see is 5 miles wide in some parts, you have millions of solar panels that need to be monitored on a day-to-day basis to detect any faults in the system, broken panels, etc. And doing this autonomously with SSTDR is going to be much easier and help the company actually survive economically by being able to do that with SSTDR.
So, what is SSTDR? It stands for Spread Spectrum Time Domain Reflectometry, and all reflectometry works off of the same basic principles. So here, for time domain reflectometry, we send a signal down a cable, and whenever the cable encounters any kind of fault, a load, or some kind of change in impedance, the incident pulse will be reflected and create a reflected pulse. As long as we have how quickly that pulse travels down the cable and then how long it takes to get back, which then we divide by 2 for round trip time, we can find the distance to these impedance discontinuities. So there are many ways of time domain reflectometry. As we see on this slide, there's just normal time domain reflectometry, which is a single pulse. But SSTDR, we use a spectrum of signals. So we modulate our a pseudo noise code with a 24 to 48 megahertz signal, and we send that down the line. And then when it comes back, we will correlate it with the original signal. So unlike TDR, it can interfere with normal signals because it's a pretty large pulse, but SSTDR can be very small. Since we have the pseudo noise code, they will only exactly align up when we get the exact same signal back. And so we can use much smaller signals, which means we can use this on live systems. So the information we can get from reflectometry includes things like the load impedance, the line impedance, or the reflected signal itself. So from here, we can see the reflection is based upon the load impedance and the line impedance. So if we rearrange that equation a little bit, we can actually extract the load impedance that happened at the wherever caused the reflection. We can find that load impedance based on the reflected signal and knowing the line's characteristic signal. So some of these, why would we want to use SSTDR impedance for measurements? Well, these are typically done with very cumbersome, expensive equipment. Think of, a whole lab workbench is the size of space that these pieces of equipment take up, because as we change frequencies, we have to change the type of equipment, because what works good at high frequencies doesn't necessarily work good at low frequencies. So there's multiple pieces of equipment, and SSTDR can provide from 0 hertz to effectively 24 or 48 megahertz and measure within a large bandwidth at once. It also can monitor the impedance response to determine photovoltaic systems health, because solar panels look like capacitors electrically, and so we could measure that capacitance change to make sure that they are still healthy and functional. So the first thing was to get a measurement box for impedance measurements. This was so that way we could change out loads quickly, so we can test multiple different impedance discontinuities. We use 50 ohm connectors for the impedance matching on the box, and then the BNC connectors allow us to use RG58 cable effectively. And RG58 cable is shielded and has great characteristics for maintaining a pretty consistent impedance to help minimize the amount of error due to signals and other external factors. So the setup is that the LCR and VNA, we will measure first because those are the current uses of what we use to measure these impedance discontinuities. So we use the LCRs for low frequencies from 0 Hertz to about 2 MHz, where the VNA is from 100 kHz up to tens of gigahertz. So we will use both the LCR and the VNA to measure across the SSTDR's bandwidth, or 24 megahertz in this case. And then we will compare the LCR and the VNA measurements with the SSTDR measurements, as well as compare where the LCR and the VNA itself overlap to see the accuracies and see if SSTDR can accurately measure the impedances as well as what the current equipment can. So these are the LCR and VNA measurements results. As we can see, it is in the tables, I have the magnitude and the angle, and then below that, I have the actual complex value for a 75 ohm, 68 picofarad load. And the difference between the LCR and VNA during its overlap was only 0.12%, which is a very small difference in percentage, and our angle percent error was only 0.08%. So the LCR and VNA very closely match to the same measured values. Unfortunately, the SSTDR measurements, we are currently working on the code to extract the load impedance from the SSTDR, but we are not finished yet. But we did do MATLAB simulations of what the SSTDR reflected signal would look like, as well as here we can see, because the SSTDR currently only shows the reflected signal. And so we can see from these for 75 ohm, 68 picofarad capacitor that the little waveform between 10 to 20 meters, which is where the load was, we can see that the waveforms very closely match. So we're hopeful that the load impedance, once we finish this program, will closely match to what the VNA and LCR meter also measured.
Okay, so switching over to my project is similar to Sam's with some slight differences. So what we wanted to look at in the first part of this project was how much of the SSTDR signal could transmit through series connected capacitors as shown in the figure here. And so we did n equals 1, 2, and 3 series connected capacitors using a similar box to what Sam showed earlier, which is in the bottom left. And we did this also, we had to use, or we chose to use, the short circuit load and open circuit load for all of these tests, because as you'll see in a minute, we can then take the difference between those two responses and focus solely on the transmitted signal and isolate that from any intermediate reflections. And the results that we found from that were, as you might expect, so more signal would pass through with fewer capacitors, and more signal would pass through with higher capacitance. So that's kind of what we were seeing, as you can see, like with the blue curve, or the blue dots rather, is one series capacitor, and the magnitude of the reflection increases with the magnitude of the capacitance. And that's true for 2 series capacitors and 3 series capacitors. What was a little unexpected was that the trend followed more or less the same line as the higher value capacitors at the lower end as well. So as you can see in the zoomed in part of the figure here, a lot of the lower value capacitors showed the same sort of trend, but we can't really rely on this under the noise floor, which was determined through Evan Benoit's research. But it was interesting to see that still followed a similar trend. And then so what we wanted to get to with that was to then see if we could use a method called dictionary matching to effectively measure impedance responses from the SSTDR reflection. And so we also wanted to do that with multiple series connected capacitors as well. The difference here is we wanted to use a match load at the end so that we could, instead of focusing on the transmitted signal, in other words, the signal that reached the end load and came back to the SSTDR device, we wanted to focus on the reflections at the capacitors themselves. And by matching the load, we eliminate the end loader effect reflection. So to do this, first it's important to talk about how we develop the dictionary to which we're matching these responses. And it's easier to handle these kinds of electromagnetic signals in the frequency domain. And so that's what we're seeing here with these equations. These are the incident signal, the reflected signal, the impedance of the line, and the total impedance and the impedance of the line, the impedance of the box, all in the frequency domain. And we're able to use that and use the equation at the top to effectively simulate the SSTDR signal and response in as it interacts with a capacitive load or impedance discontinuity on the line. And then obviously we would do the inverse Fourier transform to bring that back into the time domain. And so dictionary matching itself, so we would have to take the measurement, which is shown here in the blue curve, and this is an example of 100 picofarads, which we found at the 24 megahertz signal that we were looking at for this experiment, was a good response. And we would take that measured signal and match it up with the closest match we could find in the simulated dictionary of SSTDR responses. And as you can see here with the orange curve. And then we would normalize that match to the amplitude of the measured response and try to get as close a correlative factor as we could. And so what we're looking for is to get this yellow curve basically as close to the blue curve as possible to see if we could use the dictionary to effectively measure the capacitance that we're seeing from the SSTDR response. And we found this works well depending on the capacitance that the signal's interacting with relative to the frequency being used. And we're looking for a 0.99 correlation factor or above. And then it's a bit of a pivot, but all of this was, like Sam said, solar panels interact with the SSTDR signal much like a capacitor. Electrically, they look like capacitors to electromagnetic signal on the line. And so what we wanted to do next is see how the impedance of a solar panel changes with varying environmental factors, including irradiance, just intensity of illumination and other weather factors such as moisture and temperature. To do this, we use a setup as shown here in the figure, and we took measurements of irradiance and took note of weather and temperature to see how that affected the response. And we did this over multiple days. So for 3 days, every 30 minutes, a measurement was taken. And over those days, we had cloudy days, we had sunny, we had a little bit of rain, and we went into after sunset. And so we saw the whole spectrum of responses, and we related this data to a reference that was taken close to the standard test conditions, which is about we were able to take this pretty close. Standard test conditions are 1,000 watts per meter squared. We were able to get this to 930 watts per meter squared, and at the panel was about a room temperature. So that's what we're referencing. And what we noticed is that this irradiance curve in orange varied a lot, but didn't correlate directly with much variance in the SSTDR response, which is shown in the blue curve as a relative error plot. The three smaller spikes are a change in relative error after sunset. And so what we noticed is that there was a difference in response in both amplitude, mostly amplitude, once the panel was completely without illumination. And then the large spike, also with the note next to it, was shortly after a rainstorm. So moisture was introduced to the system, and that produced quite a large error spike relative to the reference. And to highlight that more, I show here the time domain response of that spike. And as you can see with the orange curve is the measurement at that right after that rainstorm. The blue curve is the reference. We see that that error is primarily due to a shift in velocity of propagation, which correlates to a shift in the distance that's measured by the SSTDR response. And so this is obviously going to cause a large error in our response. And to correct for that, we would have to, in order to properly monitor a system of solar cells, we would have to correct for that. And for reference, this is on a clear day after sunset. So you can see that as far as velocity of propagation, the distances line up of the peaks, they line up quite well. But the amplitude of the primary and secondary and tertiary reflections are all a little bit off. The general shape is different. And then here is one of the standard responses that we saw in some of those flat regions of the curve, in the error plot curve, where we don't really see too much variation in the response with respect to the reference. And yeah.
So in conclusion, the SSTDR impedance signals look very close to our simulation values. Unfortunately, we did not have the program finished for actually extracting the impedance signal, the impedance from the SSTDR signal, but we are currently working on that. And due to the signals looking very similar, we are very hopeful about the data that we will find. And then all of these SSTDR measurements took less than 1 hour. The VNA and LCR meter took over several weeks for all of the same measurements to be performed. So this could be a much quicker option to figure out these impedance discontinuities. And dictionary matching was a viable method for measuring series capacitances with certain specifications. So if we start measuring outside of those specifications, it might not work as well. But as long as we stay within inside those specifications, it showed very good results.
And to tie this back into why we were talking about the importance of SSTDR when it comes to solar panels and solar fields, all of this comes down to impedance and impedance discontinuities, fault detection, things like that. And so understanding how SSTDR responds to impedances such as capacitors or panels under varying illumination and weather effects is important if we want to help these large solar installations move forward in an economical way. Obviously, it was a little outside the scope of the project here to determine exactly what caused like for example, the velocity of propagation shifts and stuff and things like that. But as we gather more data and understanding of how SSTDR interacts with these things, determining whether or not we can actually measure impedance and characterize impedance discontinuities will better understand how we can correct for those things and autonomously monitor these large systems to help us move forward with green energy. And so that's the end of our presentation. Our contacts are shown here if there are any questions or comments or for any reason at all. And our references are also shown at the end here for anyone interested in further reading. And thank you.